Rupert Lowe, please.
Thank you, Chairman. I think my question is for Simon Ridley, who I see, Simon, from your CV, you've been involved in other national challenges such as COVID-19 and the Brexit situation. What concerns me is when I use my parliamentary office to ask questions of the Home Office on these issues, on virtually every occasion I get, the Home Office does not hold the information sought in these questions at the level of granularity requested. And that's for information packs, recreational activities provided, cleaning services, furnishing and decorating, antisocial behaviour. A whole raft of questions that I ask, I get that answer. So that worries me. I have asked many parliamentary questions. I've drilled down. I find that there are contracts where hotel rooms have been fully paid for, i.e. the entire hotel's been taken and yet it's half full. I think there's a lack of knowledge and understanding of these complex contracts, both within the ministerial departments and also within your department. So, from the point of view of the taxpayer, if the private sector is indulging in very complex contracts, which you're signing that aren't fit for purpose, then taxpayer money is going to be wasted massively. So again, I'd like to know, can we have complete transparency of what's in these contracts? When I ask the questions, I get that's a redacted version.
Okay.
So
I think, Rupert, we've got the message.
No, but Jeffrey, it's very important that we've got to have transparency on this if we are to get to the bottom of it. And I don't think we have transparency. And I think we haven't got transparency because very often the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing.
There have been significant challenges with how the accommodation system has developed over many it's built on contracts that were signed in 2019. The use of hotels came much later and was not at that point intended. To the point on, and we have done a lot in the department to strengthen our contract management and our commercial functions to support the scrutiny of that, and as a result have got money back for the taxpayer. We also, the Home Affairs Select Committee did a very long report into all of these issues, including into the detail of the contracts. And one of the things we have been doing in recent months is again, the Permanent Secretary requested an external review of our commercial functions in this area so we can get further challenge and make sure that we are continuing to develop our capability as best we can.
The opening moments establish a familiar institutional setting, a formal forum, an elected representative pressing for answers, and a senior official positioned as the custodian of complex systems. What transforms this from routine oversight into a moment of tension is not volume or spectacle, but resistance, subtle, procedural, and carefully framed. It slides sideways. The shift happens when a clear line of inquiry meets an invisible boundary, and the response is not refusal, but dilution. The representative's line of attack is methodical. It begins with scope, national crises, administrative burden, institutional capacity, and narrows toward specificity. The emphasis is not on ideology, but on mechanics, contracts, granularity, visibility. This is important. Accountability in this context is not about intent. It is about traceability. The insistence on detail signals a demand to follow public money through the system to see whether oversight survives complexity. Each step of the inquiry tightens the frame, moving from general concern to concrete examples of inefficiency and waste. What escalates tension is the repeated institutional refrain that the requested information does not exist at the level asked for. This is a critical moment in power dynamics. When an authority claims absence of data, it implicitly claims absence of responsibility. The system presents itself as too fragmented to be fully known, and therefore too diffuse to be fully accountable. The representative's persistence exposes this as the central conflict, whether complexity is an explanation or an excuse. As the exchange continues, the representative signals that this is not a first attempt. Prior efforts have been made through formal channels, drilling down through layers of bureaucracy, only to encounter redaction and partial disclosure. This history matters. It reframes the interaction from an isolated question to a pattern of obstruction by process. The system has learned to comply procedurally while resisting substantively. Transparency exists in form, not in function. The hook moment, where the chair attempts to move the exchange along, and the representative insists on continuing marks of visible authority contest. It is brief, controlled, and telling. Procedural. Authority seeks to regulate time and flow. Democratic authority asserts the necessity of completion. The interruption is not aggressive, but it is decisive. It signals that the inquiry is approaching something uncomfortable, something that cannot be resolved with a generic assurance. At this point, the official response shifts tone. Responsibility is redistributed across time and departments. The origins of the contracts are placed in the past, before current conditions. The use of temporary measures is framed as an unintended evolution rather than a decision. Each element is individually plausible, but collectively, they perform a familiar maneuver acknowledgement without concession. This is where escalation psychology becomes evident. The institution does not deny problems outright. It absorbs them. By referencing reviews, committees, and reforms, it projects motion and diligence. Yet the core demand, complete transparency into contractual terms, remains unmet. The system answers with process when asked for substance. This is not accidental. But by widening the field until accountability dissipates, the representative's concern centers on a simple asymmetry: private entities operating under complex agreements, public funds committed at scale, and public representatives unable to see the full terms. The implication is structural. When contracts are too complex to be understood by those charged with oversight, complexity itself becomes a shield. Misuse of authority does not always appear as overt abuse. It often manifests as the normalization of opacity. What makes this exchange particularly instructive is the absence of emotional escalation. There is no raised voice, no dramatic confrontation. Instead, the tension lies in what is not resolved. The official's assurances rely on internal mechanisms, reviews commissioned, capabilities developed, while the representative's demand is external and democratic: visibility for Parliament and, by extension, the public. These are competing models of accountability. One is inward-facing and managerial. The other is outward-facing and constitutional. The opening segment sets the stage for a broader examination of how systems manage scrutiny. When challenged, authority here does not push back aggressively. It recedes into structure. The result is a kind of stalemate where concern is acknowledged but control remains centralized. This is the quiet failure mode of oversight, not confrontation, but exhaustion. As the narrative moves forward, the key question is no longer whether mistakes were made, but whether the architecture of decision-making allows them to be fully examined. The early power shift briefly visible when the representative resists. Procedural closure reveals how fragile transparency can be when it depends on voluntary disclosure by the very systems under review. This moment is not an endpoint. It is a warning signal. It shows how easily democratic scrutiny can be slowed, softened, and redirected even in plain sight. With the initial exchange complete, the dynamic settles into something more revealing than open confrontation: institutional self-defense through normalization. The official response reframes the concerns not as active failures but as inherited. Conditions: contracts signed earlier, systems evolving under pressure, circumstances changing faster than governance structures can adapt. This framing is deliberate. By anchoring responsibility in the past, the present is insulated. Accountability becomes historical rather than operational. This is a common pattern in large bureaucracies facing scrutiny. When questioned about outcomes, authority shifts the conversation toward process improvement. The language pivots to capability building, strengthened management, external reviews, and lessons learned. Each phrase signals competence and reform, but none directly answer the underlying issue raised. Why elected oversight repeatedly encounters redacted information and missing granularity when public funds are involved? The absence of detail is not treated as a problem in itself, but as an unfortunate byproduct of scale. What's crucial here is how legality and legitimacy subtly diverge. Nothing described is explicitly unlawful. Contracts exist. Reviews have been conducted, committees have reported, funds have, in some cases, been recovered. Yet legality alone is not the threshold being tested. The representative is probing legitimacy, whether the system operates in a way that allows meaningful democratic supervision. The response, however, remains anchored to compliance, not transparency. This is where escalation psychology deepens. Rather than resisting the critique, the institution absorbs it and dilutes it. By acknowledging challenges while emphasizing corrective mechanisms, the system presents itself as self-regulating. Oversight in this model becomes internal, rather than external. The message is implicit but clear: trust the process. Scrutiny is already happening elsewhere, but this creates a structural tension. Parliamentary questions are designed to pierce internal processes, not defer to them. When an official cites select committee reports and internal reviews as substitutes for direct answers, authority subtly shifts away from the immediate forum. Power is redistributed upward and outward, away from the questioning representative. The effect is procedural displacement. The question is valid, but not answerable here, not now. Not in full, the representative's earlier emphasis on paid for. Capacity entire facilities contracted yet partially used casts a long shadow over these assurances. This is not an abstract policy concern. It is a measurable outcome. When such outcomes coexist with claims of improved contract management, the gap between narrative and reality becomes the central issue. The institution's confidence contrasts with the representative's experience of opacity. Misuse of authority in this context is subtle. It is not about intimidation or coercion, but about control of information flow. By deciding what level of detail exists, what can be disclosed, and in what format, the institution defines the limits of scrutiny. This is power exercised quietly, through documentation standards and disclosure thresholds. The citizen, represented here by an elected official, is left navigating a maze whose layout is controlled by the very entity under examination. The reference to external reviews deserves particular attention. External scrutiny is invoked as evidence of seriousness, yet its findings are not fully integrated into the present exchange. This creates a paradox. Oversight is acknowledged, but its substance remains inaccessible. Transparency becomes performative rather than practical. The appearance of accountability is maintained, while the mechanics remain obscure. As the conversation progresses, the tempo slows. This is another defensive feature of institutional power. Slowness drains urgency. By stretching accountability across timelines, past contracts, ongoing reviews, future improvements, the immediate pressure dissipates. The representative's insistence on present-day clarity struggles against this temporal diffusion. The system buys time, not through refusal, but through postponement. What emerges is a portrait of governance under strain. Complex contracts, emergency measures, and evolving demands have produced an environment where no single actor claims full visibility. Yet this diffusion of knowledge does not dissolve responsibility. It merely makes it harder to assign. The representative's warning about wasted taxpayer money highlights the real-world consequences of this arrangement. When no one fully sees the whole, inefficiency becomes normalized. The power shift here is not dramatic, but it is decisive. The institution maintains control by framing itself as already engaged in reform, already aware, already correcting. The representative's role is reduced to that of a signaler, not a driver. Questions are absorbed into the system's narrative of continuous improvement. As this segment closes, the audience is left with an unresolved tension. Oversight mechanisms exist, yet feel distant. Transparency is promised, yet fragmented. The system appears busy, active, and self-aware, but still resistant to full exposure. This is the quiet architecture of institutional failure, not collapse, but insulation. The next stage will examine how such insulation becomes durable and how repeated deflection can transform exceptional measures into permanent norms. By the final phase of this exchange, what remains most striking is not what has been said, but what has been structurally avoided. The conversation closes without resolution, yet it leaves behind a clear map of how authority protects itself when pressed. The mechanisms are subtle, legal, and normalized, which is precisely why they are so effective. No single statement is false. No single action is indefensible. And yet, taken together, they form a system that resists full accountability. The official response emphasizes continuity and improvement. Contract management has been strengthened. Commercial functions have been reviewed. External challenge has been welcomed. These claims operate as a form of institutional reassurance. They signal that the system is aware of its own vulnerabilities and is actively addressing them. But reassurance is not the same as disclosure. The distinction matters because democratic oversight depends not on confidence but on verification. Throughout the exchange, authority is exercised through control of narrative scope. The institution defines which questions are answerable and which are reframed. Requests for granular data are met with explanations about system complexity. Concerns about waste are answered with references to recovered funds. The effect is to move laterally around the core issue rather than confront it directly. This is not evasion in the traditional sense. It is displacement. This displacement has consequences. When oversight bodies are told that information does not exist in usable form, the burden subtly shifts. Instead of the institution justifying its actions, the questioner must justify the question. Why ask for such granularity? Why expect visibility across fragmented systems? The implicit suggestion is that the demand itself is unreasonable, given the scale and speed of operations. In this way, complexity becomes a moral defense. What we see here is a form of authority that is comfortable with scrutiny as long as it remains abstract. Reports, reviews, and committees provide distance. They transform lived outcomes empty. Rooms, unused capacity, public expense into aggregated findings. This abstraction protects decision-makers from direct accountability. The representative's insistence on concrete transparency threatens that protection, which is why it encounters resistance. Institutional failure, in this context, is not dramatic or malicious. It is procedural. Systems designed for emergency response become normalized. Temporary measures solidify into long-term arrangements. Contracts signed under one set of assumptions persist under entirely different conditions. Yet the oversight framework does not evolve at the same pace. Parliamentary questions remain the same, but the answers grow more opaque. The power dynamic at the end of the exchange reflects this imbalance. The official speaks with the authority of process and continuity. The representative speaks with the authority of mandate and representation. But only one side controls the information architecture. This asymmetry ensures that, even when concerns are validated rhetorically, they do not translate into immediate corrective action. This is how patterns of misuse endure without overt wrongdoing. Authority is not abused through force or intimidation, but through normalization of limited disclosure. Each individual decision to redact, to defer, to reference another review is defensible. The pattern they create is not. Over time, these decisions erode the capacity of democratic institutions to perform their oversight role effectively. The exchange also highlights a deeper institutional assumption, that accountability is something the system can manage internally. External scrutiny is welcomed, but on the system's terms. Transparency is offered, but selectively. This inversion is subtle but profound. In a democratic framework, institutions are accountable to the public, not merely to their own standards of improvement. When that inversion goes unchallenged, trust becomes performative. As the discussion ends, there is no dramatic conclusion, no decisive ruling, no immediate reform. Instead, there is a quiet return to business as usual. And that is the point. The absence of resolution is itself the outcome. It demonstrates how easily serious concerns can be acknowledged without being resolved, how oversight can be absorbed without effect. What this moment ultimately reveals is the fragility of accountability when it relies on voluntary transparency. Systems built on trust and complexity can function efficiently, but they are vulnerable to opacity. Without sustained, enforceable demands for disclosure, oversight becomes episodic rather than systemic. This exchange is not an anomaly, it is a case study. It shows how modern institutions manage pressure, how they frame responsibility, and how they protect themselves from full exposure. The lesson is not about individual intent, but about structural incentives. When complexity shields authority and process substitutes for answers, the risk is not just wasted resources, but the gradual erosion of democratic control. In the end, the most consequential aspect of this interaction is its normalcy. Nothing explodes, nothing collapses, and yet the core concern remains unresolved. That is how institutional failure often looks in practice. Quiet, procedural, and entirely lawful until its cumulative effects become impossible to ignore.